The night was silent except for the steady patter of rain against the cold pavement. The city, usually alive with the hum of passing cars and distant conversations, had fallen into an eerie quiet as the winter storm crept in. The air was crisp, the kind that seeped into bones and wrapped around the forgotten corners of the world. In one such corner, tucked away in a dark alley between towering brick buildings, a small, abandoned dog curled up inside a battered cardboard box. His frail body trembled, his damp fur offering little protection against the biting cold. His breath came in short, uneven puffs, his tiny ribs rising and falling beneath his muddy coat. He didn't understand why he was here, why the hands that once fed him had pushed him away, leaving him to fend for himself in a world too big, too cruel for someone so small. His ears twitched at the distant sounds of the city, the muffled voices of strangers, the distant roar of an engine splashing through puddles. But no footsteps approached him, no voice called his name, no one was coming for him. The last of his strength was fading. His paws, once eager to run and chase after familiar faces, now lay motionless beneath his trembling body. He could barely keep his eyes open, but he had learned that in this new world, closing them for too long could mean never opening them again. The rain dripped from the edge of the box, soaking into the torn cardboard, and he let out a small whimper. Not loud enough for anyone to hear, but a plea nonetheless. He was hungry, exhausted, but more than anything, he was afraid. Somewhere in the distance, a baby's cry cut through the night. The sound was faint at first, nearly lost beneath the wind, but the abandoned dog lifted his head slightly, his ears perking up. It was not like the usual city noises. It was fragile, desperate, just like him. The scent of milk drifted faintly through the cold air, carried by the breeze. It was unfamiliar, yet something deep inside him stirred. He didn't know why, but the sound pulled at something buried within him, something beyond hunger or fear. Slowly, unsteadily, he pushed himself onto his shaky legs. His paws slipped slightly on the wet ground, but he steadied himself and took a step forward. Then another. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to move toward that sound. At the edge of the alley, the world opened up before him, wider, louder, filled with the distant glow of streetlights, reflecting on wet pavement. His body told him to stop, to stay hidden where it was safe. But the cry came again, louder this time. And he knew. Whatever was out there needed him. Across the city, just outside the gates of a small orphanage, a newborn baby lay bundled in a thin, worn-out blanket. The infant's tiny hands twitched against the cold air, his face scrunched in discomfort as he whimpered weakly. The fabric that wrapped around him was damp, barely offering any warmth. Whoever had left him here had disappeared into the night, leaving nothing behind. No note, no name, nothing to explain why. The world around him was too vast, too empty. His soft cries echoed against the walls, swallowed by the wind. No one answered. His breaths grew uneven, his body shivering against the relentless chill. He was too small, too fragile for a world that had already turned its back on him. He was alone, until a pair of hesitant paws stepped closer. The abandoned dog, now soaking wet and shivering, had followed the sound all the way to this place. He paused a few feet away, his nose twitching as he took in the scent. Warm, faint, but alive. The baby's small cries softened as if sensing the presence near him. The abandoned dog took another step, then another, his movements careful, almost cautious. He had never seen a creature like this before, so tiny, so helpless. But somehow he understood. Just like him, this small being had been left behind. Just like him, it had no one. And just like him, it needed warmth. Without hesitation, the abandoned dog curled up beside the baby, pressing his damp body against the infant's side. The baby stirred, his tiny fingers brushing against the dog's fur, his breathing slowly becoming steadier. The rain continued to fall around them, but for the first time in what felt like forever, neither of them was truly alone. The abandoned dog didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if anyone would come, if they would be saved, if this small life beside him had a future brighter than the cold night they shared. All he knew was that as long as he had strength left in his body, he wouldn't leave. He would stay. He would protect. But how could a small, starving dog protect a baby who couldn't even speak? What could he possibly do? And would anyone find them before it was too late? The cold pressed against the small, abandoned dog, its wet fur clinging to its fragile frame. Hunger gnawed at its stomach, but that pain was nothing compared to the emptiness that had settled inside since the moment it had been left behind. It had wandered alone, searching for food, searching for warmth, but mostly searching for something it didn't understand. Now it had found something, or rather someone. The baby, wrapped in a thin, damp blanket, lay motionless on the orphanage steps, its tiny breaths uneven, its soft cries barely rising above the sound of rain tapping against the pavement. The dog hesitated, ears twitching as it processed the unfamiliar sight. It had never seen a human so small before. The scent was different too, warm, fragile, tinged with the faint sweetness of milk. But underneath that was something else, something the dog recognized all too well. Abandonment. Alone. The baby shifted slightly, a tiny hand slipping free from the blanket, fingers curling and uncurling in the cold air. The movement was weak, barely noticeable, but to the abandoned dog, it was everything. It stepped forward, hesitantly at first, its paws cautious against the wet ground. It had been pushed away before, by strangers who didn't want a starving stray near them, by shop owners who chased it off with harsh words and even harsher hands. But this tiny creature didn't push it away. It couldn't. The dog lowered its nose, pressing it gently against the baby's small fingers. They were icy, too cold. Something stirred deep inside the dog, something instinctual, something more powerful than fear or hunger. The baby needed warmth, it needed protection, and for the first time in its short life, the abandoned dog had something to protect. The dog lay down beside the baby, pressing its thin body against the small bundle of fabric. Its fur was damp, its body weak, but it was still warm, warmer than the cold air that threatened to steal what little heat the child had left. The baby stirred, a soft murmur escaping its lips, its fingers brushing against the dog's fur. The touch was barely there, but it sent a spark through the dog's tired limbs. It pressed closer, curling around the baby as much as its small body would allow, blocking out as much of the cold as it could. The rain continued to fall, but they didn't move. For a long time, there was only the sound of shallow breaths, the faint rhythm of two lost souls clinging to each other. The dog's heartbeat slowed as exhaustion took over, but it didn't let sleep claim it fully. It had to stay awake. It had to watch over the baby. But the warmth, the comfort, was something it hadn't felt in so long. And so, despite its best efforts, the dog drifted off, its small body rising and falling with the gentle movement of the baby's breath. Two abandoned lives, lost in the night. But for the first time, neither of them was truly alone. The world stirred before the sun did. A distant car engine rumbled down the empty street, tires splashing against the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open, the faint sound of footsteps echoing against the concrete. The city was waking up, but the abandoned dog had been awake for a while now. Hunger clawed at its insides, sharper than before. It had spent what little energy it had left keeping the baby warm through the night, and now its body ached in protest. It needed food, but more importantly, the baby needed food. The dog lifted its head, blinking away exhaustion. The baby was still there, still breathing, still warm against its fur. But it was weak, too weak. It wouldn't last much longer. The dog's ears flicked toward the street, listening for movement. Its instincts screamed at it to stay, to not leave the tiny life it had sworn to protect. But another instinct battled against it. Survival, not for itself, but for the child. The abandoned dog stood on unsteady legs, shaking off the cold that clung to its fur. It took one last look at the baby, its heart pounding with uncertainty. Would it be okay? What if something happened while it was gone? But if it didn't find food, the baby wouldn't survive. There was no choice. The dog turned toward the street, eyes scanning the unfamiliar world before it. It would find something. It had to. And then it would come back. Because now, it had someone waiting for it. The city stirred awake beneath the cold morning sky, its streets slick with rain, reflecting the dull glow of streetlights. The night had passed, but for those who had no place to call home, the darkness never truly lifted. The abandoned dog moved carefully, his paws tender from the rough pavement, his stomach twisting with hunger. He had left the baby back at the orphanage steps, curled up in his thin blanket, too weak to cry any louder. The baby needed food, warmth, something more than just his protection, and so the small dog had forced himself to leave, to find anything that could help. But the world was unkind. His first stop had been a narrow alleyway behind a bakery, where the smell of bread and butter still lingered in the air. The scent was intoxicating, his body urging him forward. But the second he edged closer to the trash bin, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Get out of here, mutt!" A heavy boot slammed against the pavement near him, and he scurried backward, heart pounding. The baker, a broad-shouldered man in a flour-dusted apron, held up a broom like a weapon. "You're not getting scraps from me," he barked before turning away. The dog whimpered but knew better than to try again. He had learned the rules of the streets. Dogs like him were not welcome. He tried again at a small diner a few blocks away, drawn by the smell of frying bacon. He hovered near the back door, waiting, hoping someone would toss something his way. But when the door swung open, he was met with nothing but cold glares. "Shoo! Get lost!" A metal tray crashed to the ground near his paws, sending him bolting into the shadows. His stomach twisted in despair. What would he do now? Back at the orphanage steps, the baby stirred, his tiny fists clenching as the cold seeped through his thin blanket. He had been silent for a while, his small body conserving energy. But now, instinct took over. A cry pierced the morning air, weak, trembling, but unmistakable. It was a sound of need, a sound that cut through the noise of the waking city. But who would listen? The orphanage remained silent behind its locked doors. The world moved forward, indifferent to the struggle of a life too small to fight for itself. Except for one man. A figure sat hunched against a building nearby, wrapped in layers of worn-out fabric. His beard was unkempt, his face lined with years of hardship. His name had been forgotten long ago, lost in the whispers of the streets where no one asked questions. But when the baby's cry reached his ears, something in him stirred. He squinted through the gray morning light, searching for the source of the sound. Then he saw it, a small bundle on the orphanage steps, and standing beside it, trembling but unmoving, was the abandoned dog. The old man blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. But no, it was real. A stray dog, thin and weak, standing guard over a helpless child. The baby cried again, softer this time. The dog let out a low whimper and pressed his body closer to the bundle, trying to shield the child from the cold. The man felt his chest tighten. How long had they been here? Who had left them? More importantly, why hadn't the dog left? Years on the streets had taught him that survival was about self-preservation. No one cared for the weak. And yet, this small dog had refused to abandon the baby. The man knew hunger, knew the sharp bite of loneliness. He had spent countless nights curled against brick walls, shivering beneath thin layers of cloth. But he had never seen anything like this. Something inside him told him to move. For the first time in a long time, he listened. He pushed himself up, his limbs stiff from the cold. Step by step, he made his way toward them. The dog noticed him immediately. It let out a low growl, its body tensing despite its clear exhaustion. The man stopped a few feet away, raising his hands slightly. "Easy, buddy," he murmured. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog didn't trust him. It stood its ground, small but fierce, its eyes dark with warning. The man exhaled. "You've been protecting him, haven't you?" His voice was softer now, less of a question, more of an understanding. The dog's ears flicked at his tone, but it didn't move. The man knelt down slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. He looked at the baby, his tiny chest rising and falling with each uneven breath. He needed help. And yet, the man hesitated. He had nothing. No home, no food, barely even enough to keep himself alive. How could he care for a child? His hands trembled as he reached for the baby, but the second he moved, the dog let out a sharp bark, stepping in front of him. It wasn't going to let him take the baby. The man let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. All right, you win. I won't take him from you." But the baby couldn't stay here. Someone would have to do something. Before the man could decide his next move, another figure appeared at the end of the alley. A man, dressed in clean but worn clothes, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat, watched them. The old man felt it immediately. Something was off. The stranger's eyes flickered between the baby and the abandoned dog, calculating, assessing. "That's quite a situation," the stranger finally said. His voice was smooth, too smooth. The old man didn't like it. He had lived too long on the streets to trust people who talked like that. The stranger took a step forward. "You found it?" "Not him, not the baby, just it." The old man's stomach twisted. This wasn't right. The dog sensed it too. It stepped in front of the baby again, its growl returning, its small body ready to fight. The stranger smirked. "A baby left out here alone? Pretty dangerous." The old man clenched his fists. "Yeah, dangerous people everywhere." The stranger tilted his head. "Maybe I should take it." The dog barked, stepping closer. The old man felt his instincts scream. Number. This wasn't a good man. This was someone who saw an opportunity, and the baby was the opportunity. The old man had no power, no home, no safety in this world, but neither did this abandoned dog, and that hadn't stopped it from standing its ground. So neither would he. "I don't think so," the old man said, his voice firmer than it had been in years. The stranger's expression darkened. "You planning to stop me?" The dog growled again. The old man clenched his fists. Neither of them had much, but they had each other, an old man with nothing to lose and a dog with everything to protect, and that would have to be enough. The only question now, would they make it out of this alive? The night air was thick with tension, the weight of an unspoken danger pressing against the old man's chest. He could feel the dampness settling into his bones, but the chill of the cold was nothing compared to the icy fear clawing at his gut. The baby stirred in his arms, a soft whimper escaping its tiny lips. It was weak, hungry. It needed help, and the abandoned dog beside him knew it too. The small stray paced nervously at his feet, ears twitching at every sound in the alley. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting. For what? The old man wasn't sure. But then he heard it. Footsteps. More than one pair. He turned his head slightly, his instincts sharpened from years of surviving on the streets. The shadows at the far end of the alley shifted, and within seconds, figures emerged from the darkness. 3 men. They weren't police. They weren't good Samaritans. And the way they moved, the way they watched the baby instead of him, set every alarm in his mind screaming. One of them, a tall man with a slick coat and a too-casual stance, took a slow step forward. "Looks like you've got quite the find there, old man." The old man gritted his teeth, tightening his hold on the baby. "Not for sale." A chuckle. "Oh, come on. We both know you can't take care of it. Give it here and we'll handle the rest." The abandoned dog let out a deep, rumbling growl. The tension snapped, the tall man lunged forward, and the dog attacked. The small stray was a blur of motion, teeth flashing as it lunged at the nearest man's leg. A startled yell echoed through the alley as the man stumbled backward, trying to shake the dog off. The distraction was all the old man needed. He turned on his heel and ran. The baby let out a startled cry as the sudden movement jolted it, but he didn't stop. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, the dog released its grip and sprinted after them, its paws slapping against the wet pavement. "Get them!" someone shouted. Footsteps thundered behind them. The city blurred into streaks of orange streetlights and deep shadows as the old man pushed forward. His only thought, "I have to get them to safety." But where? The streets weren't safe. The shelters wouldn't take him in, not with a baby. And the police? He couldn't risk it. They would take one look at him, a homeless man with a stolen baby, and they wouldn't ask questions. They'd assume the worst. He needed a place to hide, and fast. The rain started again, slow at first, then heavier, soaking through his thin coat. The baby whimpered, its cries barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. His legs burned, his body screamed for rest. Then, he saw it. A warehouse. Its rusted metal doors were slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond them. He veered off the main road, slipping inside just as the dog darted past him, its body tense and alert. The moment they were in, he shoved the door shut, pressing his weight against it. Outside, the voices grew louder, their footsteps slowing. They were looking. They knew he was close. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts as he listened. One of the men cursed. "Damn it! Where'd they go?" Silence. Then another voice. "Check the streets! They won't get far!" A beat passed. Then the footsteps faded. The old man exhaled slowly, his body sagging with exhaustion. The dog stayed at his side, its ears still pricked, its body rigid with tension. They weren't safe. Not yet. But for now, they had a moment to breathe. His arms ached as he looked down at the baby, its tiny face barely visible in the dim light. He ran a hand gently over the child's forehead, his calloused fingers lingering for a moment. So small, so fragile. And somehow, it had survived this long. Just like him, just like the dog. They were a strange group, a homeless man, a stray dog, and a baby no one wanted. But fate had brought them together, and now he had to figure out what came next. They spent hours in the warehouse, waiting. The rain continued outside, a steady rhythm against the metal roof. The baby had fallen into an uneasy sleep, and the dog remained curled beside him, its small body a source of warmth against the cold night. But peace didn't last. A distant siren wailed, and then flashing red and blue lights reflected through the cracks in the warehouse walls. The old man's stomach twisted. The police. And judging by the urgency in the sirens, they weren't just passing through. Someone had called them. Someone had reported a missing baby. His pulse quickened. This wasn't good. If they found him, if they saw him like this, what would they think? The sound of car doors slamming shut sent a jolt of fear through his chest. He had two choices, stay and explain, or run again. But before he could decide, the warehouse door creaked open. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing right on him. "Hands up!" Instinct took over. He clutched the baby tighter, stepping back. The dog barked loudly, stepping in front of him like a shield. But to the police, it didn't look like protection. It looked like threat. A voice crackled over a radio. "Suspect found. Appears to be armed with a... Wait, it's a baby? The officers hesitated, their guns lowering slightly as they took in the sight before them. A frail old man, a tiny baby in his arms, and a fierce, protective dog standing guard. One of the officers took a cautious step forward. "Sir, put the child down. We just want to talk." The old man's grip tightened. He wanted to believe them. But after everything? After the way the world had treated people like him? Could he trust them? The dog let out another growl, sensing his hesitation. And in that moment, standing in the cold under the sharp glare of police lights, he had to make a choice. Run again? Or finally trust that someone else could help? The question hung heavy in the air, and whatever happened next would change everything. The moment stretched, thick with uncertainty. The old man stood frozen, the baby limp in his arms, his breath shallow and uneven. The abandoned dog stood guard beside him, growling softly, its fur bristling. The police officers hesitated, their weapons lowered but their eyes still sharp, calculating the situation. Then, a voice cut through the tension. "Wait!" A woman stepped forward, pushing past the line of officers. She was young, dressed in scrubs, her hospital badge swinging from a lanyard around her neck. Her face was full of concern, her eyes locked on the baby. "I'm a nurse," she announced. "That child needs medical attention right now." The old man's grip tightened around the small bundle. He had spent years being dismissed, ignored, and cast aside. Trusting strangers had never been an option, but this was different. The baby let out a small, weak cry, a sound so fragile it barely reached the night air. The nurse stepped closer. "Please, if we don't act now, it might be too late." A war raged inside the old man. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know if he could believe her. But the baby needed help. And if he didn't let go now, he might never get another chance. With trembling hands, he slowly extended the baby toward the nurse. The moment she took the child into her arms, a low, sharp growl came from the abandoned dog. The small stray had spent every waking moment protecting this child. It had endured cold, hunger, and fear, but it had never abandoned its duty. And now, watching the baby being taken away, it panicked. As the nurse turned toward the ambulance, the dog lunged forward, placing itself between her and the emergency vehicle. A desperate, protective instinct overrode all fear. "Whoa, easy, buddy," one of the officers said, stepping back. The dog barked sharply, its eyes darting between the baby and the strangers surrounding them. It didn't understand what was happening. It only knew one thing. It wasn't going to let anyone take the baby away. Tears burned at the edges of the old man's eyes. "Hey, it's okay." His voice cracked as he knelt beside the dog, placing a hand gently on its head. "They're trying to help." But the dog didn't move. It let out another whimper, pushing its small body closer to the baby, its tail low, its entire stance radiating distress. The nurse paused. She had seen many things in her years at the hospital, but this, a stray dog, thin and weak, risking everything to protect a child. Her heart clenched. She knelt down, her voice soft, careful. "You've been taking care of him, haven't you?" The dog didn't respond, but it didn't need to. She understood. "All right," she said. "You can come too." The dog stopped growling, its ears flicking forward. The old man exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And just like that, they all moved, together, toward the ambulance. The hospital was bright and sterile, a sharp contrast to the dark streets where they had come from. The baby was rushed into the emergency room, a team of doctors working quickly to stabilize his fragile body. His tiny chest rose and fell, his small fingers twitching as if searching for something familiar. Outside the room, the abandoned dog paced anxiously, his tail tucked, his ears pinned back. It didn't understand what was happening, but it knew something was wrong. The old man sat on a bench, his hands gripping his knees. He had spent his life being invisible, but now everyone was looking at him. Reporters had already arrived, cameras flashing, voices murmuring questions he didn't know how to answer. But then, everything changed. A nurse, scrolling through her phone, let out a small gasp. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's everywhere." Within hours, the story had gone viral. Abandoned dog saves baby from the streets. Stray dog protects child until help arrives. The images were everywhere. The small dog standing guard over the baby, its thin body shielding the child from the cold. Thousands of people shared the story, moved by the loyalty, the devotion, the unbreakable bond between a dog and a child who had nothing but each other. And then, something unexpected happened. A wealthy family, sitting in their lavish home miles away, scrolled through the headlines. The mother, a woman with kind eyes and a haunted expression, stared at the photos for a long time. Then she whispered, "He looks just like him." Her husband, seated beside her, frowned. "Like who?" She swallowed hard, her hands shaking. "Like our son." They had lost their child years ago. It had been a tragedy, one that shattered their family. They had searched endlessly, hoping for a miracle, but as time passed, hope faded. But now, this baby, the one rescued by a stray dog, looked exactly like the son they had lost. They needed to know. They had to know. The woman reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the hospital's number. On the other side of the city, the old man sat beside the abandoned dog, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The dog wouldn't move from the baby's door, refusing to rest, refusing to leave. And then, the phone at the nurse's station rang. She picked it up, unaware that the call she was about to take would change everything. The baby's fate was no longer uncertain. But was this family truly his? Would the abandoned dog, the one who had risked everything to keep him safe, be accepted too? Or would this be the moment they were finally separated forever? The world held its breath, waiting, because no one knew what would happen next. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital room, mingling with the quiet hum of medical equipment. The baby lay swaddled in soft blankets, his tiny fingers curling instinctively whenever someone brushed against his hand. His breaths were steady now, his color returning to a healthy pink. Outside the room, a different kind of tension filled the air. The results had come in. The doctors had confirmed it. The baby was their son. The wealthy couple stood frozen in place, the mother clutching her husband's arm as the reality of it sank in. After years of searching, grieving, and hoping against the impossible, their child, the baby they had lost, had been found. Tears welled in the mother's eyes. She covered her mouth, overwhelmed by the moment. The father exhaled sharply, his emotions barely contained. "We need to see him." The nurse nodded, gesturing toward the hospital room. "Of course, but—" She hesitated before continuing. "There's something else you need to know." The couple exchanged a glance, their excitement momentarily replaced by unease. "What is it?" The nurse took a deep breath. "There's someone else involved in your son's survival, and he won't leave without him." Inside the hospital room, the abandoned dog sat at the base of the crib, his body curled protectively around the baby's blankets. Despite the soft mattress and plush pillows offered to him, he refused to move. His eyes, once dull from hunger and exhaustion, now held only one thing: determination. The baby stirred, his lips parting as if searching for something. He let out a small whimper, and instantly the dog nuzzled closer, resting his chin against the side of the crib. The baby relaxed. A nurse had tried to move the dog earlier, but the baby had cried so hard, his tiny body shaking. Since then, no one had dared to separate them. The abandoned dog had been there from the beginning. when no one else was. He had been the first warmth the baby had ever known, the first guardian to protect him from the cold world outside. And even now, with the baby safe in a hospital bed, the dog remained on guard, as if still fearing that something might take him away. The wealthy couple entered the room, their eyes locked onto their child. The mother let out a quiet sob, rushing to the crib, her hands trembling as she gently cupped the baby's tiny face. "Oh, my sweet boy." The father stood beside her, his face unreadable, as if still processing the impossible reality before him. But just as they leaned closer, the dog lifted his head, his ears twitching. He let out a soft growl, not of aggression, but of caution. The father frowned. "What's that stray doing in here?" The mother flinched, her focus breaking for the first time. "Wait, this is the dog from the news, isn't it?" The nurse nodded. "He's the reason your son is alive. He never left him, not even for a second." The father let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temple. "Look, we're grateful, truly. But we can't take in a stray dog. It's not suitable." The words hung in the air, cold and final. The dog's ears flattened, his body lowering instinctively, as if he understood that he was being cast aside, again. The nurse's expression hardened slightly. "I understand your concerns, sir, but I think you should see something before you make that decision." She reached over and gently touched the baby's cheek. The infant blinked, his small lips parting. Then, as if sensing the distance, he turned his head frantically, searching. His tiny hands reached out, his face scrunching. And then the wail came, a heart-wrenching, gasping sob. The couple stiffened, startled by the sudden distress. The dog instantly sat up, alert. He whined softly, stepping toward the crib. And just like that, the baby stopped crying. The moment the dog was near again, the infant calmed, his tiny fingers reaching out until they brushed against the fur. The mother gasped, a hand flying to her chest. "Oh my God." The father was silent, watching as the abandoned dog gently rested his head against the baby's side. The baby cooed softly, curling closer as if the presence of the dog was the only comfort he had ever known. And in that moment, the couple realized the truth. Their child already had a family. The father ran a hand through his hair, his gaze shifting between the baby and the dog. His mind raced with logic. This was a stray, a street animal, not something that belonged in their world. But love wasn't about logic. It was in the way their son reached for the dog instinctively, in the way his tiny body had relaxed only when the dog was near. It was in the fact that no matter what happened before, the dog had never abandoned him. The mother spoke first, her voice soft but certain. "We can't take him away from his protector." The father hesitated. "Are you saying we should take in a stray?" The mother turned to him, her eyes filled with tears and understanding. "I'm saying we should take in the only family our son has ever known." Silence stretched between them. The dog, unaware of the weight of the moment, lowered his head to the baby's chest, letting out a soft sigh of relief. And that was it. That was the moment the father made his decision. He let out a breath, shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "Looks like we just adopted a dog." The nurse smiled, the weight in the room lifting. The mother reached down, running her fingers gently through the dog's fur. "Welcome to the family." The papers were signed. The hospital staff watched, tears in their eyes, as the once abandoned dog curled up beside his baby, his tail wagging for the first time in what felt like forever. By the time they left the hospital, the world already knew their story. The headlines were everywhere. The dog that saved a life and found a family. And as they stepped into their new home, the baby cradled safely in his mother's arms, the dog trotting proudly beside them, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a rescue story. This was the story of a love that refused to be left behind. A year had passed since that cold, fateful night when an abandoned dog refused to leave the side of a helpless baby. Now, the world they once knew, the one filled with hunger, loneliness, and uncertainty, felt like nothing more than a distant memory. The baby, now a toddling, bright-eyed boy, had grown strong. His cheeks were round with health, his laughter a constant melody in the house. He had learned to walk, his tiny feet stumbling at first, but always finding balance, especially when his ever-faithful companion was nearby. The dog was no longer just a stray. He had a name now. He had a home. And most importantly, he had a family. No longer did he have to curl up in the cold, fearing abandonment. No longer did he have to search for scraps or dodge the cruel hands of those who saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. Now he had a soft bed near the fireplace, a bowl that was always full, and a little boy who adored him more than anything in the world. But even with all the comforts of his new life, the dog's true purpose had never changed. He was still the baby's protector, his guardian, his best friend. The little boy's first word had been doggy. The moment the word left his lips, the entire family had laughed, filled with both amusement and undeniable warmth. But for the dog, it was something else entirely. It was recognition. It was acceptance. It was proof that he was no longer just a passing presence in this child's life. He was his family. Wherever the boy went, the dog followed, his loyal shadow, always a step behind, always watching. At night, when the boy slept in his crib, the dog lay curled beneath it, his ears twitching at every little noise, ready to defend the one who had become his entire world. During the day, the boy would waddle through the house, his tiny hands gripping onto the dog's fur for support. And though he was still small, still learning, he had never once fallen, not when his protector was always there to steady him. The sun was warm that afternoon, casting golden light over the rolling green hills behind their home. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh grass, the kind that tickled bare feet and invited playful laughter. The boy, now steady on his feet, ran across the open field, his giggles filling the air. And right beside him, matching his every step, was the dog who had saved his life. They moved together as if they had always belonged to each other. Because, in truth, they had. There was no hesitation in their movements, no fear of the world. Just joy, pure and simple, the kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you were meant to be. The little boy stumbled slightly, his foot catching on a patch of uneven grass. The dog reacted instantly, pressing his body close to steady him before he could fall. The boy let out a surprised laugh, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck in a clumsy embrace. The dog let out a small huff, as if amused, before nuzzling the boy affectionately. It was a moment so simple, so ordinary, yet extraordinary in every way, because once upon a time, neither of them had anyone, and now they had each other. From the porch, the parents watched, their hands intertwined. The mother leaned into her husband, her voice filled with quiet emotion. They saved each other. The father nodded, his eyes never leaving the two figures in the field. I think they always will. Because this wasn't just a story about rescue. It was a story about love. A love that had formed in the darkest of nights, when a stray dog refused to abandon a child who had been left behind. A love that had endured every trial, every hardship, every obstacle. A love that had turned a stray into a guardian, and a baby into his forever companion. The boy turned back toward the house, his chubby fingers waving excitedly. The dog barked, his tail wagging, before racing after him, always by his side, always protecting. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the field, one thing was certain: they were never lost. They were never alone. because together they had found home. This story is a testament to the power of love, resilience, and unwavering loyalty. It reminds us that family isn't just about blood. It's about those who stand by us, even in the darkest moments. A once abandoned dog, unwanted and forgotten, found his purpose not in survival, but in protecting the most vulnerable life. In return, the child gave him what he had never known: a home, a family, and unconditional love. Their bond proves that sometimes the ones who save us aren't the ones we expect. Love doesn't need words, it simply needs a heart willing to stay. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.